So the last few videos we've been talking about natural selection as the mechanism for evolution, right? Traits are inherited, there's variation in the population. Those individuals that have a variation that is best fit for that specific environment, whatever that might be, are the ones that reproduce and send those traits off to the next generation, thus changing the frequency of alleles within the population. So that's natural selection. That's a form of adaptive evolution. So typically when species are going through, or natural selection is acting on a population, that will result in some way in adaptation. Many different forms of adaptation, right? But evolution does not require natural selection to occur. Evolution itself is just change within a population. Right? So a population is changing. The genetic composition of a population is changing over time. Natural selection is just one of those mechanisms that can cause that change. But here, we're going to dive into other ways that populations can change, the genetic composition of a population can change, that are not natural selection. So other mechanisms of evolution that are not natural selection. So the genetic composition of a population can change not because of natural selection, but just because organisms are moving from one population to another. So when organisms migrate or move from one area to another, sometimes they might leave one population and enter into another population. That movement of organisms, if they're carrying different genes from one population to another, that could change the genetic composition of that population. Right, so here we have one population, so these two beetles are the same species, let's say, but let's say one population on this side of the mountain has only dominant alleles. And let's say this population on the other side of the mountain has only recessive alleles, right? So if we get some migration, one beetle migrates and moves over here to this other population, that changes pretty significantly the genetic composition of this population. So the allele frequency has changed, so we would say this population has evolved without natural selection playing a part. Migration, coupled with this idea of what we call gene flow, which is where reproductive individuals move from one population to another, tends to be how alleles are transferred, or new genes or different genes are transferred between populations. So migration would be this individual moves over to this new population, right? That's migration. Gene flow now is that once this new individual moves over there, it then reproduces and creates offspring when it's in this new population. Okay, so that's gene flow, slightly, subtly different processes. So the greater the gene flow there is between two populations, the more similar those populations tend to be, right? So let's say we get some gene flow going both from this dominant population over here to this population that's only recessive alleles, right? Or vice versa. We have some of these recessive alleles moving and adding their alleles through gene flow to this population over here. So the more gene flow there is, the fewer genetic differences there will be between these two populations. So natural selection is not playing a role here, but we're still seeing changes in the frequency of alleles within a population. Another form of non-adaptive evolution, or evolution that does not require natural selection in order for it to occur, the idea of genetic drift is that just due to random chance, some alleles might become more frequent than others. Just due to randomly, let's say, maybe in one generation, all of the eggs that have a dominant allele were just happen to be fertilized by all of the sperm that had the dominant allele. Okay, that random, it's possible, right? Random chance. Like every time you flip a coin, it's 50-50 chance that's going to end up heads. So every time these eggs were formed, they got a dominant allele at this one location. And they just randomly happen to be fertilized by a sperm that had a dominant allele. Okay, it's possible, right? So random fluctuations in allele frequencies can happen. That's just called genetic drift, right? Genes will just change their frequencies not due to natural selection, just because random chance of reproduction. There are some factors that kind of exacerbate this random changes in genetic frequency, though, in allele frequency. We're going to kind of break them down in two categories. The first being a founder effect. So we see this often when a small subset of a population moves into a new area, a new land area, or a new environment, new habitat where that species was not present before. So let's say, for example, we have some beetles. These are all the same species of beetle. Some are green, some are red. Let's say a new landmass opens up, right? So some of these beetles are going to move from the mainland to an island. And just due to random chance, only the red beetles made it. Just randomly. It's not that they're any better adapted or they're better suited for this environment. It's just due to random chance that only the red ones moved over. So these ones founding this new population will pass on that gene for having a red coat or a red color to them, right? Not necessarily because it's adaptive, just due to random chance that they're the ones that happen to found that new population. Or related to this idea is bottleneck events. So if in our original population we have a wide diversity, we have many different types of alleles for a specific gene or genes, right? Many different forms of a trait. Bottleneck events are usually some sort of random stochastic event, so meaning it's just completely random, like a forest fire blows through or a flood, right? That significantly decreases the population. And those that survive, those that make it through this bottleneck event, don't necessarily make it through because they're better suited for the environment. They make it through just because they happen to be in the right place at the right time, right? So let's say a forest fire goes through an area, right? Those trees that survive, let's say, they don't necessarily survive because they are better suited to the environment, but they might survive just because they happen to be not in the area where that forest fire made it through. And so we significantly reduce the genetic diversity of a population after a bottleneck event. So if in our original population we had maybe a third red alleles, a third green alleles, and a third orange alleles, maybe after that bottlenecking event, just due to random chance, none of these red alleles maybe made it through, okay? And so that leaves our population with a lower genetic diversity and an overall smaller population, okay? And so in a smaller population, it makes it more likely for random fluctuations of alleles to occur, genetic drift, that could potentially remove either the orange or the green allele from the surviving population. So some sort of random stochastic bottlenecking event means that not all of the individuals that were in the original population get to survive, but those that do survive don't survive because they're any better suited. They survive just because they were in the right place at the right time.